Christof, Rühl, Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Energy Policy at the Columbia University, currently in China. Speaking of the demand outlook and China's outlook, Christof, you're a week in the country. What does it feel from the ground? Are the headlines over-egging the pudding here, or is China facing a difficult window?
So let me plug in a remark for you to come back later, which is that, of course, to keep this interesting, I don't agree with Mike, it's only demand. It's also about supply. It's also about the oil market having a life on its own, not just the macroeconomy. So we can come back later. But in China, as you know, I was sort of very skeptical on Chinese growth for a long time, on the positive growth expectations of many analysts. And I have to say, having spent now the week here, I become more gloomy, become more skeptical. So the atmosphere is not good. You know, from the outside, I at least thought, okay, so don't grow at 8% anymore, they grow at 5%, you know, but what's the big deal? That's still a lot, especially when you're European. From here, you know, it is like the perception is as if the economy stagnates. Consumption savings rate have increased by 15%. You know, that's a lot. People don't spend money. People just came out of this lockdown, not only not with a big bounce, as many analysts had predicted, but they come out of the lockdown sort of gingerly. It's like the prison door is open, but the prisoner doesn't believe it and doesn't really want to get out. So it is still sort of slow, and it still lacks the kind of enthusiasm, which, you know, the exuberance which you always had when you came to China, and confirms that it may take a long time and some more government help to get consumption up to speed. And in the meantime, you know, traffic is still thinner. Demand numbers, I think, will come in much lower than many hopeful oil analysts has predicted. And it's the only game in town in terms of growing economy. For oil demand, we only have China, India, and the Middle East itself. You know? So if that doesn't change, and if the economy here turns out closer to 4 than to 5, and it starts to look like that, and if the sort of consumer pessimism, which has to do a lot with the property markets, of course, but also the fact that the government has made it pretty clear they will not prop up real estate again and create another bubble. They will sort of hope that it doesn't, they will prevent it from falling into a bottomless pit, but then they will devote resources to reorganizing their economies into light manufacturing, into EV manufacturing, into new technology manufacturing, which are precisely the areas where they are very efficient and have overcapacity and need to export. And if they are allowed to export, they will wipe out the European and the Japanese attempts at replicating cheap EVs. But that is, of course, precisely the reason why first the US and who knows in the future, Japan and Europe are starting to erect trade barriers, because their car industry is a bit of a holy cow and is very labor intensive, very important. And I think now, in the headquarters of BMW or Toyota or Volkswagen, people are scratching their heads and are realizing that in pure electric vehicles, they cannot compete with China. And that doesn't bode well for China's chances to export. And if China is
Tesla is really the only one who can. Tesla is the only one who really can, because they've had that first mover advantage.
Then they produce here. And according to the Chinese experts, they say that even Tesla cannot compete on cost. And then you have this excellent manufacturing capacity and too much capacity, but if you can't export, you can't use it, and that bodes, you know, that's why this political conflict will hurt economically, and all of that doesn't bode very well for the prospects of the Chinese economy at the moment.
I mean, we all are somewhat removed from the granular end of things, but the Minister of Saudi Arabia, essentially the de facto leader of the OPEC Plus group, did go to great lengths to explain in very granular detail of how they would hold Russia to account for the commitment that they've made. Just that sort of granular detail would indicate that there's obviously some question that the ability to hold Russia to account, or that Russia has not been meeting their obligation. At least that would be my reading.
So I think to answer that Russia question, that might be the case, but it's also, I mean, we have to get real about this. The world has changed. You know, on the oil market, we say always it's a long-term game, and sometimes it shows up in very short intervals. And this is one of these occasions. You just draw a line with the market share of OPEC Plus and the market share of the US. And you see, that's what I meant by supply side changes. You see how production growth relentlessly continues in the US and translates since the beginning of this series of cuts into a gain in market share. And the market share of OPEC Plus goes down. And those countries who cut, Russia and Saudi Arabia, are the ones who are paying the price for it, And we should not kid ourselves. If there's an organization called OPEC, which is based on unanimous decisions, right? That's their rule. And then they have some members who say, we have a voluntary cut. That's the only thing that tells me, as a neutral observer, is that they have an internal argument. Otherwise, why do I need voluntary cuts when I have a decision rule which is voluntary, but for all? And I think so. Their credibility has suffered greatly, number one, against this background of changes in market shares and of relentless production increases in the US, which again underestimated by energy analysts who just always do the rig count. They haven't realized how much well and rig productivity has gone up in the US. They're at record levels. Add to that Guyana, add to that Brazil coming on. So non-OPEC is pretty strong performing at the moment. And OPEC doesn't look, number one, doesn't look very critical. And number two, Russia has bigger fish to fry at the moment. They're not exactly in a financial bind. They have a war at their hands. They are trying to sort of play everybody against everybody else because they're in a corner. They would have to be shown that there is a mechanism by which these cuts translates into a revenue gain, meaning whatever you gain on the price side and you lose on the volume side needs to add up to a positive whole for Russia. Otherwise, they will always try to find some way out. And I think what the minister was probably addressing was this export embargo for products, which didn't last very long, which had many observers scratching their heads. Why do they do this? They have enough, maybe not gasoline, but diesel. And was probably a hope for other members of OPEC Plus that it would translate into a more durable output cut. And without that, Russian promises have not been fulfilled entirely. In fact, since the Ukraine war started, the total export of Russia has increased. Again, in market share terms, it was a very clear picture. So they gained a little. And so I think it is really a matter where you either risk continuing sort of going alone down this very difficult road and end up with carrying the burden for everybody else up to the point where the losses in volume are no longer compensated by price increases, which are not very forthcoming. And make no mistake, it seems to require a lot stronger cuts given the demand picture, because every time they cut it ticks up for a day and then it falls again because credibility has been lost. So that needs to be addressed in a more comprehensive way, and that's an important thought for the future, or at some point they have one other option open, right, which is to say, okay, solid, we're going to swamp the market, we're going to show you, if you don't want to play with us, what it looks like if you have really opened the floodgates and you really have low prices. That would be a threat. Which you can do only once, but then you have to do it. But if you do it,
that's what happened. That's what happened 3.5 years ago when in March 2020 to April 2020 when clearly Russia and Saudi couldn't find alignment. Mike, looking
and now with the interview with that and so on, that mind in the back of your head, and it becomes interesting.
Christof, your thoughts on that? Saudi's ability to keep giving on this, or is this the last straw, you think, or the last gift from Saudi? Christof.
In that particular question, I am no better judge than you or Mike or anybody else on this globe. But what we do know is that times are changing. So in 2020, when OPEC Plus was new, COVID was a global crisis, the G20 with the IEA, it's unthinkable today, basically commended OPEC Plus to cut. Right? There was a short debate when the oil price goes to almost zero or beyond, should we leave it to the market and the adjustment which has to happen on the supply side, or should we do some government quota games? And it was decided with Trump going to Riyadh, meeting everyone, so decided that OPEC Plus basically got, if not a green light in official terms, and the verbal support for taking the lead on adjusting the oil price, the oil market, finally stabilizing the oil market, what they always said. That happened, but now, years later, we have two wars, at our hands. We have, and in war and love, everything is allowed as far as Russia is concerned, I think. And we do have now a long history of words and chasing speculators and doing this and this, which is not good, because it just leaves those gleeful who said, "Oh, see, I told you so." There's nothing behind that. And Mike is right. We shouldn't overdo it. This is not a beer market. But I want to throw up one more thought about the current market. We tend to still think that we are talking about high oil prices. If you do, now that inflation is back, and if you do the inflation adjustment of the oil price, and you adjust for efficiency gains in the way we use oil, which is like 2% every single year, then current prices are not very high by historical standards, not at all, in fact. Then, by those adjustments, the highest price ever was in 79, would today translate into more than 400, roughly $400. That caused a recession. But remember, the very high price period from 2011 to 2014, when prices were stable 3 years in a row and did not cause a recession, that in today's term would be about $200. Right? So a price, going to 100 or 120 or so would probably not kill the global economy in terms of growth. So the inflation impact is what we all looked at, and we lost sight of this a little bit. So in a sense, the market has already turned down without this showing up in the nominal numbers we're always looking at. So in that sense in particular, I understand that the Saudis are getting nervous. And basically every oil producer and exporter is already feeling the pinch. So we should not, expect them to be willing to just take another plunge. And that's why it becomes, for me, more and more a binary things. Either cohesion increases and meaningful stabilization of a falling market is achieved, or at some point we might have a repeat of the threat, to enforce cohesion by saying, okay, if you don't do it, then we don't play ball either on the part of Saudi Arabia.
Well, even if we get, and it does, the soundings are that the OPEC Plus, or at least those members within it, I think it's 8 members that are really consolidating their positions in these cuts going into the new year. And this Saudi minister feels very confident that they will all deliver as promised, and have done so in the past, and take him at his view, and he tends to not be wrong too often. But U.S. production up 800,000+ barrels a day. Iran exports up to 1 million+ barrels a day. Guyana and others adding some barrels here and there. Going into a new year, can we see that trend continue, or is that a plateau in your opinion? The non-OPEC plus countries' supply continuing to increase as they did in 2023.
There's another point in all of this, which I always say, the oil markets connect long and short-term thinking. And one way in which the world has changed, which comes home now, is what we already mentioned, that the US is no longer importing. And so the market shares are now moving very quickly into disfavor of OPEC. Another thing which is likely to happen within this decade, and despite all the OPEC research forecasts and so on, is that oil demand is likely to peak. And what we have currently is this slightly strange picture of OPEC countries trying to cut and persuade others to cut, and at the same time massively expanding their own capacity. Right? Why do they do this? And I think that signals more than anything that they know that the market is about to peak. What will happen when oil demand peaks is, in a shrinking market, the low-cost producer is king. Right? In order to keep your export volumes constant in a shrinking market, you need to increase your share. How do you increase your share? It's going to be price competition. And this is going to be putting very, very heavy pressure on OPEC countries. And this is why they expand their capacity, because they can produce cheaper than Russia and then the rest of the world. And so they will, at least in the initial rounds of this, being the ones left standing, increasing their market share again. If that wouldn't be on the back of their mind in these day-to-day battles, then they would not do a good job, and they would not expand capacity like they do. So I'm pretty positive that this is an element which is very little discussed, but which plays a role in today's decisions.
Let's just go to final comment, Christof, leading with you on. We're about to break for the festive season for a month before we start our new year with the Global Energy Outlook Forum on January 10th. But a month over the horizon, what do you think? Where does this go? It's only a few days after the OPEC Plus announcement. The market adopts. Where do you think this goes for a month of distraction from the festive season?
I don't see actually many disruptions. It seems that prices will settle a little lower than many people had expected or some people had hoped. And if there is no surprises, in terms of another outbreak of a war, something in Venezuela or something in the Ukraine or in Gaza, then oil demand will not dramatically shift in a month, and the supply will not dramatically shift in a month. But it should be a moment for reflection, because to me it is still sometimes surprising the level of analysis, always just looking at adding up countries and barrels and day after day, is not going to give us good answers for this. And allow me sort of one short response on the peak demand questions.
Yeah.
If you're in the numbers game, and if you just assume that over the next, say, 10 years, the efficiency improvements in the world, in the way the world uses its oil, mileage for cars, the way the heating systems work, all of this continue like they have in the last 25 to 30 years. If you only assume that, then oil demand will peak before 2030, full stop. So that is a realistic option. And this is a second big event, just like the US becoming a net exporter, which would just change the whole game. And if you have these, usually energy markets are at the receiving ends. You have economic events, wars, political events, and then they are reflected in energy markets. It's very rare that in this triangle between geopolitics, global economy, global energy, something is triggered by the energy markets. The shale revolution and the energy independence of the US was such an event. And if oil demand peaks and then doesn't plateau but falls off a little bit, there's going to be another one of these events. And that's why they have, of course, long shadows before they happen and long repercussions after they have happened. And that's the unexplained part, which we always see and which surprises us when we just do barrel counting.